Today we're discussing a great subject. We're discussing what is the role of shame in the soldiers' lives in The Things They Carried by Tim O'Brien. We're wondering, does shame propel them to heroism or stupidity?
I think in a lot of ways, both. In most of the decisions throughout the book, we see the shame that they face propelling them to many things, helping another while costing someone else.
Exactly. And it leads them through most of decisions that they make.
Yes.
Which we can talk about when we bring into our first quote here.
This is from the first chapter of the book, a great chapter. It really introduces the book and the characters so well. And it says, they carried shameful memories. They carried the common secret of cowardice, barely restrained, the instinct to run or freeze or hide. And in many respects, this was the heaviest burden of all. For it could never be put down. It required a perfect balance, a perfect posture.
And I think that is a phenomenal quote for what we're talking about.
Absolutely.
Because you know, the framing of it as a burden that they carry, one of the things, like the book talks about in that chapter of all the things they carry with them on a daily basis, I think that it's very important to frame it as one of those things, because it's not just something that they feel momentarily, you know, in certain specific scenarios. It's something that they're always carrying with them and always trying to repress. I mean, when you're in a place like that, it's very hard not to feel fear almost at all times.
Absolutely. And I think that it was more the shame of that fear that led them to the things they did. They border this line, and that line, I guess you could say, is fear, but the line between cowardice and heroism.
Exactly.
I mean, if you really think about it, the line, it's kind of like a tightrope or a slack line, which, speaking of, I think we can relate this to personal experience, because I've really been working on my posture lately, which has helped with my slackline game.
Indeed, and I think, you know, just like on a slack line, it has its ups and downs, it has its ebbs and flows, but you have to keep up the act. You have to keep it up at all times, because they want to be perceived as this rock, this absolutely, you know, tough guy.
This emotionless character.
Indeed, and I think that is one of those things that it's always like a tightrope for them. It's always like a slack line.
Absolutely.
And I think that is definitely one of the things that they carry.
I think throughout the book, like you said, that like they're portrayed and expected to be this emotionless killer.
Exactly.
Like this just a pawn in another game of chess.
Exactly. And I think you can sort of feel that burden, as it says, the burden of that they're just a foot soldier. They're just a pawn in some bigger game. And that contributes often to their shame, to their fear. Because not only is it just the fear of their awful surroundings, it's the fear that they're not going to be good enough. Because in the grand scheme of things, maybe they aren't really that important.
Yeah.
I mean, what you both said about pawns, I think is very good, because like in chess, a pawn, if it reaches the end, it can become a queen. It can become wherever.
Yeah, when you rank up.
If I may continue, sorry, we'll get back to you in just one moment.
Let's continue.
But these are real people with real potential, and they have to act as pawns.
Yes. Absolutely.
Yes, and that obviously contributes to the shame, as I was just saying. And, you know, it's something it's present, it's ever present within the novel, as we can look in our second quote right here. Also from the first chapter, a little bit later on.
And it says, men killed and died because they were embarrassed not to. It was what had brought them to the war in the first place. Nothing positive, no dreams of honor or glory. Just to avoid the blush of dishonor. They died as so not to die of embarrassment.
And I mean, that is probably even better than the first quote.
Absolutely.
To sum it up. They died, they killed and died in that war, just as one of their main motivations being the shame they felt for how they were acting. You know, they were ashamed at the perfectly reasonable human emotions that they were feeling. And that really led them to some terrible things.
Yes, and like the quote that Leo just read, I think it's very important to mention the died from embarrassment part, because that is a really real effect. I mean, I fell down the stairs the other day while I was walking to my fridge to get a drink, and I felt as if I was going to die from embarrassment, because it was just a very embarrassing situation. I mean, you're falling down the stairs, you're losing coordination, but furthermore, that really does tie into, even with nobody watching, if I felt that embarrassment, imagine what these soldiers felt.
And it's sort of like the not the dichotomy, but just the split between the fear of dying and the fear itself, the fear of showing it. And they almost have to weigh the options of which they're more against, of which they're more afraid of. And I think that that's very important.
And I think, like you said, we can all really almost connect to that. Not at all on the same level. It's not life or death here, but we all have an experience of just pure embarrassment. Embarrassment that just makes you want to just hide. And that's what they were going throughout the whole time they were there. But it was also a decision between embarrassment, the embarrassment of being scared of what they were doing, what they were seeing, what they saw a man could do to another man, and the dying of real death.
Yeah.
I mean, and really, what this book just really dives right into, I mean, it really gets right into it, is, I mean, there's the surface level themes of the war, but what it really dives into is the actual human experience.
Yeah, it explores not just how generally people felt, generally, people felt bad in war, or just, the troop movements of it, how a lot of history textbooks may look at it. It explores specifically what was happening to individuals inside of the war. And I think that that's very important.
With that, if nobody else wants to touch on that, I think we should move on to our third quote.
Yes, let's continue.
Let's continue.
Let's continue.
This is from later in the book, page 84. It says...
It's from The Dentist.
It's from the chapter The Dentist.
What happened in The Dentist is that one of the characters was deathly afraid of going to the dentist ever since he was a little kid. And they had the entire platoon go to the dentist.
Sorry, if I may add, I think it was Ted Lavender.
It
right?
was Ted.
Yes,
it may have
I
been
believe
Ted
so.
Lavender. And what the quote says is that the embarrassment must have turned a screw in his head. And what that is referring to is that when the dentist came, he was too afraid to even let the dentist do anything to him. He passed out from fear. And I think that passing out from fear is something that not only just happened there, and not only happened literally in many other times during the book, it also represents just the overwhelming effect that the fear had on them during many times. I mean, it was just detrimental to their health.
Absolutely, and I think we should continue from there. That idea of him passing out, fainting from fear, when this was a man who could kill families, villages, entire villages, and just watch it and be almost emotionless or desensitized to it. Sorry. It just, I think that just really shows what the war did to these men and how, they could do all these heinous things, see all these heinous things, but then something as simple as a tooth.
Something as simple as, a legitimate medical professional could be the thing that causes them to have all this fear. And then after that, as it says, the embarrassment turned a screw in his head. The embarrassment of it pushes them forward beyond just the actual event itself. And later on in the chapter, I find it important to say, right after this, he goes to the dentist and had him remove a perfectly okay tooth just to prove that he wasn't afraid of the dentist anymore.
Yes.
And I think that is very similar to many things that happened within the book, where they were just so intent on proving that they could do something or that they were able to do something that they did different things that were unnecessary, that were even harmful. But
Lavender himself is a really good example of
Yeah.
that. I mean, this was a man who, every day, does it say specifically what drug he was on?
They said dope. I mean,
Dope.
I
Definite-
assume
Vietnam area, probably meth or heroin.
I would assume they said he was feeling mellow, so maybe he just smoked a lot of weed, maybe heroin. That's unimportant.
Unimportant, but
Now, if I may add, and it's kind of a vaulted topic in many cases I've seen. However, I do think that this does dive in some sense, even if it's not intentional, into themes of racism during the civil rights movement in the 60s, wherein many people, they went and they fought and they were injured, and many people died, in fact, for the justice of their race, which was being abused. But in many cases, it can be glossed over. These people were embarrassed because of the societal norms that were enforced upon them.
And a lot of their struggle was facing the embarrassment, that's an allegory to the civil rights movement and what was going on in Vietnam. I mean, half of the battle of all of the soldiers wasn't just facing their enemies and facing the awful conditions. It was facing their own emotions about those conditions.
And if I may, I do think that this is one of the reasons why this book is one of the great masterpieces of our time, because it really does dive into all of the subjects that were taking place at this time period.
And I think it really brings the humanity of the soldiers into it, discussing their shame and what that caused them to do. I think that really humanizes them in a way.
I mean, even in this podcast, as we speak right now, we can be caught as these emotionless observers. But to bring in my own humanity into it, I think it's important to mention, one time, a few years ago, I was shoved into a school bathroom, and this guy, he dunked my head into the toilet water over and over again. And I don't talk about that very much, but it's important to, around the ones that you really care for, to be open with them about that type of thing, because I do experience a sort of trauma and discomfort whenever I think about that, simply because I feel the feeling of the toilet water dripping down my face every time I go to bed at night.
absolutely. Let's continue from there. I thank you so much for opening up.
And I think that's an outstanding way to wrap up our current quote and move on to the next one, which is from much later in the book, page 147. It's, he wished he could have explained some of this, how he had been braver than he ever thought possible, but how he had not been so brave as he wanted to be. And I think that really shows the endless push that they have to be braver, to show less shame, to
Absolutely.
be even more emotionless, and to just do more than they thought possible.
I think later on, around this time in the book, we see more of that as they progress into more of this character of just, like we said earlier, an emotionless pawn in another game.
Exactly. And in a way, while that's one of the things that they're coping with, that they feel unimportant, they feel like a pawn, that's also, in a way, kind of what they're trying to be, even unintentionally, is that they're trying to be emotionless. They're trying to be a good soldier, so they're trying to be a pawn in someone else's game. They're both escaping this idea of being an emotionless pawn, and then also that's what they're fighting for, in a way.
I think even at the end of the book, we see even O'Brien turning into that.
Oh, absolutely.
When he talks about when his first, I believe the first week he was there, when they went through that village and the only body they found was of an old Vietnamese man, and they propped him up. They were shaking his hands, and he just fell into this. He almost describes it as shame.
Yeah.
Just seeing it, not even participating.
Shame of just being associated with it in a way.
Yes, absolutely.
And as we wrap up this podcast, I think it's important to mention, as I said earlier, this is why it's such a really good book, because it gets into these topics of shame that are so rarely discussed.
Absolutely, and that's a great way to end off. We're running out of time, so I guess I'll let Jacob introduce himself.
Hi, I'm Jacob Kirkwood. I'm a sophomore at East High School, and I enjoy podcasting.
I'm Leo Martinez. I'm also a sophomore at East High School, and I also enjoy podcasting very much.
All right, thank you. That's all we have time for today.
Hey,
we'll talk to you later.
Hey,
Thank you so much, Ms. Mizrak.